Welcome back to Tales from the Bridge. Chris Hadfield is on the show this week. We are over the moon to talk to Chris. Chris has a new book out called Final Orbit, October 7th. We're definitely going to talk about that and so much more because it's Chris Hadfield. He does so much. He's so active. He is freestyling every day. Find out what that means by listening to the end of the episode. We really appreciate you listening today. And remember, like the show, review the show, rate the show. We would love to hear from you. Email us, give us any book recommendations, film recommendations, and of course, go back and listen to old episodes. We've got lots of episodes, lots of interviews with authors, filmmakers, actors. We try to reach all the people that you want to hear, so we really appreciate you joining us today. All right, Chris is waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
We're very excited to be speaking with a special author today. Not that all of our guests aren't special, but this author has written some of the most true-to-life and engaging science fiction thrillers in recent years. His Apollo Murders trilogy, which include The Apollo Murders, The Defector, and the soon-to-be-released novel called Final Orbit, plunge readers into the Cold War space race, weaving espionage, political intrigue, and the dangers of human spaceflight. What makes these novels stand apart is their meticulous attention to the reality of spaceflight, the procedures, the hardwares, the risks, all brought to life with the kind of detail that makes you feel like you're right there in mission control or strapped into the cockpit. But what's particularly interesting about our author isn't that he writes about space, but that he writes from space. That's right, he's also an astronaut, an actual astronaut who has spent months in orbit around the planet, visiting 2 space stations, traveling in several launch vehicles. He was the first Canadian to command the International Space Station. He performed spacewalks, delivered and installed the Canadarm2, and has received honorary degrees, is an Order of Canada recipient, and has a school and an airport named after him. But of course, many know him for the most famous cover of a David Bowie song ever, Space Oddity, from orbit with his guitar. Yes, we have Colonel Chris Hadfield with us. Thank you so much for being here. How are you, Chris?
A little bit embarrassed after that introduction, but thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you going through all that stuff. Thank you.
No problem. I gotta paint the picture of who's on the show with us here today. Yeah, appreciate you being here. And of course, us being a science fiction podcast, we're really interested not only in the work you've done in space, but also primarily your writing. So can we start off by getting you to talk a little bit about your science fiction books? In particular, let's focus on the Apollo Murders series and your latest book that's coming out in early October.
Sure. I'm a big science fiction fan, always have been. It was what expanded my horizons as a kid growing up of, reading Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and gosh, all of them, Bradbury. To me, it was just growing up in rural Southern Ontario. My horizon wasn't all that far away, and to be thinking about what might be possible. And then, Star Trek on TV and 2001, where Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick put together that amazing movie. To me, all of that was really important as to how I perceive the universe and how I perceive my own opportunities. So that's what inspired me, art and reading and other people's imaginations. That's what inspired me to try and attempt to turn myself into an astronaut. And now I'm on the other end of that flow, having, as you mentioned, flown in space 3 times and commanded a spaceship. It's given me almost unique in the world insight to be able to write about it, not just nonfiction, which I've done. I've done 3 nonfiction books, but to write thriller fiction, science fiction, and to make it, as you so graciously said, as realistic and as compelling as I possibly could. So it occurred to me several years ago that maybe I had learned enough about writing, and it was the time of life where I could effectively write a fiction book. I had a publisher reach out to me, actually, a guy that I trusted over in England, a guy named John Butler. And here's a science fiction little sub-story for you. The Bradbury family, Ray Bradbury's family. Ray Bradbury, of course, wrote some brilliant stuff, including The Martian Chronicles. And the Folio Society, which makes beautifully bound collector version of books, they wanted to re-release The Martian Chronicles. And they wanted someone to write a new and fresh, interesting introduction for it. And they asked me, and I'd only written nonfiction at the time, but I thought this will be a good writing challenge. And so I reread the book, which was terrific. And then I spent quite a while thinking about it, and I wrote the best intro I could. I pretty like a 3,000 word intro, big intro. And on the basis of that intro, this publisher in England said, I'm pretty sure you could write fiction. And I've got this idea for a book called, I think I'd call it The Apollo Murders. And I don't know, it's plural, so a couple people die, and it has to do with Apollo. I haven't thought about the plot at all, but and so that's where the germ of the idea came from. And then I just tried to launch into learning how to be a fiction author, and I'm just dumbfounded at the success of the series of the Apollo Murders and then The Defector, and now the early reaction to Final Orbit is just superb. So it's been a lot of fun, really interesting way to share the spaceflight experience, but also to turn it around from the way that I was inspired when I was a little kid.
So your knowledge that you bring from the real world astronauting informs the realism and accuracy for sure in these books, and that comes out very clearly as we read them. In fact, The Apollo Murders was a book that we talked about in one of our episodes of this podcast. Talk to me a bit about that kind of accuracy versus drama and character. Is there a trade-off when you're trying to build character or build that intrigue versus building in the accuracy that gets a lot of us really excited?
Yeah, it's a trade-off for sure. But at the same time, you know what it's like when you're in a movie theater and you're watching a movie and something happens to completely take you out of the moment. You know, maybe somebody makes a noise, or there's something in the movie that is so stupid or wrong that you all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm just sitting in a room watching a movie, and you lose the bubble. And the same thing for me happens when I'm reading a book and they get something glaringly wrong. It's just like, well, now, then the rest of the whole book just is somehow soured for me if they haven't gotten the fundamental details right. Because I want to suspend disbelief. I want this to be compelling. I want what I'm reading to be truly escapist. And imagine if what Arthur C. Clarke, when all those, he invented an orbit, the Clarke orbit. He was brilliant enough as a person that he didn't just write terrific science fiction, but he knew his stuff enough that we named an orbit after him because it's a really useful orbit. Anyway, so I want to be that type of writer, not just soap opera. And for me, therefore, because it's an extremely technical field and I've got the technical background, I research each book for about a year before I start writing it. And then as I'm writing it, it's a constant research exercise. But that's where so much of the interesting story comes too. The possibilities of this strange environment and the weirdness of a lot of the factual things that are happening. That's what gives a lot of the room for the plot to mature. And to some degree, the spaceship or the machinery can sort of become a character because it's pivotal as to how this mechanical thing behaves or misbehaves that then drives the plot sequence as well. So I find, it's a constriction. But the whole purpose of the book is to be entertaining and fun and where you just got to keep turning the pages. And so I try and balance both of them as best I can.
And that's also, I guess, your part of your research must be history because they are historical fiction and they seem to me to be extremely true to life. So as part of that, you must be becoming a bit of a historian as well because a lot of this was all of this was before your time.
Well, I'm always interested in a lot of different things, and a lot of people feel that right now is the most important time in history because this is while I'm alive, right? And everything that ever happened would just happen to set me up to be alive, which is, sort of everybody's own vanity, and it's pretty normal. But I find it kind of overwhelming to think of the world that way. And I find a lot of comfort in history because it used to be way harder. Life used to be much harder than it is now. And it's easy to think because of all the problems you're facing as an adult right now, that there's no way it could have been this hard for my grandma or my great grandma. And I find digging into history and getting the reality of how people function and how they solve problems and what they had to face, I find it very reassuring. And it gives me a perspective to then readdress maybe the lack of immensity of the problems that I'm facing today, or at least put them in perspective. So I've always been a history fan. And if I hadn't become an astronaut, I think paleontology and archaeology or geology, which is the ancient history, is where I really would have gone into, because it's all interesting to me. But the early 70s, where I set the Apollo Murder series, was an amazingly tumultuous time of recent history, with the Nixon's presidency coming apart, with Watergate and all that criminal activity, and the huge civil rights riots that were going on in the U.S., and the Cold War, at a peak there in the 60s and 70s, and the end of the Apollo era. So all of that transition within the space program, and Vietnam going on and winding down from Vietnam, and the Weather Underground was blowing up bombs all across the U.S. at all these federal institutions. All of that was really happening at the same time, and so that was a great period for me to just set my stories, because it's such a richness of potential plot lines.
For sure. And for those of us who have read The Apollo Murders and The Defector, but have not received advanced copies of Final Orbit, is there anything you can say that you'd like to say to our listeners about that book? What's it about? And what can you say to grasp the interest of our listeners?
Sure. Final Orbit happens in the summer of 75, when, in the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were aiming nuclear missiles at each other, another subset of the population said, could we use space to symbolically show that actually we can cooperate, even though we fundamentally are at war with each other? And so they came up with the idea of Apollo-Soyuz, launch an American Apollo and a Soviet Soyuz, and dock them together in space, where everybody could look up and see it go over, and those two crews could shake hands, and it would symbolize maybe the better nature of people in amongst the reality of some of the bad stuff going on. And that happened in July of 75. And at the same time, the Americans had built a space station called Skylab that then they had essentially then abandoned. But it was still orbiting the world, this derelict space station. And at the same time, the Chinese were starting their space program. And there had been a big secret push to have Chinese astronauts. So they'd actually selected astronauts and built a training facility for them. And they built the big communications relay ships to send all around the world. All that was really going on at the same time. And so I took those plot elements and put them together in July of 1975. To have some pretty tense moments. And I'm just delighted reading the early reviews of the book. Someone just published today, they said it is phenomenal and fun and exciting, with a drama that flows. And they said fans of Asimov and Andy Weir and James Michener are going to love this book. And I'm like, holy cow, that's crazy company to be in. But it's very heartening to spend 2 years toiling away on a book and then have someone else, come back and say, hey, you're really going to you ought to read this book. It's a lot of fun.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to read it when it comes out. And you are in good company here. We've had Andy Weir on this show, not Asimov, unfortunately, but in any case.
Yeah, I know Andy. When he wrote The Martian, I got to read it before it came out, and I on that original version, I did hey, you should read this book. It's great. One of those blurbs on the cover. And then I've been consulting with Andy recently for the next book that he's writing. Really interesting guy. And boy, he does a great job of showing people in those very, very realistically in those very unusual circumstances. I got a lot of respect for the way Andy writes.
Yeah, I think there's some overlap in your styles to a certain extent, right? Like in terms of the accuracy. And so guess you can't tell us anything about what he's working on, can you?
Nope.
All right.
As a science fiction fan and an astronaut, are there themes that pop up in some of the sci-fi books that you read or maybe you watch on film or TV that kind of drive you crazy, like to push you to the other side?
Oh yeah, almost all of it, because so many folks just value cinematography and bad human behavior over actually what's happening. So like I'm in the theater watching Gravity, and the world's turning the wrong way, and gravity only applies to certain people and not other people. And George Clooney is whizzing around like some sort of space cowboy rescuing the poor, pathetic Sandra Bullock. And it is, I mean, if it's pure science fiction, then you have a lot more freedom. But if you're writing about something that's actually happening, like these are crew on a space station or a space shuttle or both, then if you just disregard the reality of the space shuttle and the space station, then one, to me, it's just, why didn't you try and at least make it real? Like, you would do that. You wouldn't, like, if it happened on Earth, you wouldn't have them driving down the highway and suddenly they're floating 60 feet off the ground, or the car turns into a lemon or something. Like, it's just, they would make it real given the confines of how things actually work. And I just find it really lazy and disappointing that when you have a clear structure of reality to build from, that you just ignore it. And just assume that the viewer or the reader is stupid and doesn't care, or won't notice. I watched an episode there was an old TV show called I Dream of Jeannie. And, the characters in that were kind of funny. It was during the space race that went on. But they had Major Nelson take off and then fly and then land somewhere, just a quick little vignette so that they could show that he changed from one location to the other in the TV show. And in the 10 seconds where they showed him take off, fly, and land, they had 3 different airplanes, like entirely different models of airplanes. And I'm watching that going, what was that? What were those? I was like 9 years old and I'm going, what was that? Those were 3 different types of airplanes. Was that 3 different people? What happened? Why did they do that? Couldn't they get 3 pictures of an F4? How come? And even at 9 years old, I was like disappointed that they didn't even try. And so I think it's really important, if you're going to be an author, to pay attention and do your job right, and make things real and believable wherever you can, because then it makes the plot and the intrigue and the things that are fictional, I think, much more compelling.
Yeah, and it's not arcane knowledge. Like the information is available to you, right, or to the researcher, right? Like, it's.
I don't know how James Michener ever wrote those things that he wrote. He must have had a huge research staff. But now, I mean, at one point when I was writing the Apollo murders, we were drilling down into the surface of the moon. It was the Lunokhod Soviet remote-controlled rover. And I was just going, I wonder how far it drilled down with that little probe on the nose. You just put the question into the World Wide Web, and you can find out the answer to almost anything if you just know how to phrase your question. I almost never have to phone a friend or reach out beyond what I can find readily available at my fingertips, literally. And now, fortunately, though, I can call Bob Crippen when I'm researching Final Orbit and say, so you were working in Mission Control when all this Apollo-Soyuz was happening. Oh, and you lived in the Skylab simulator for a couple months to develop that, procedures. So it's nice to be able to phone the true experts. But really, the availability of information for research now is unprecedented, and it's a huge gift to an author.
I'm a little curious as well, too, Chris, about beyond the technical accuracy of your books as well, too, because you have experience and a perspective on these things as a combat pilot and a test pilot and, of course, an astronaut of things from the human perspective. What were the things that maybe, despite your training, maybe goosed your adrenaline and got you really feeling the moment? Did you ever try to revisit those moments to insert those into your books for the drama of it all?
Yeah, I think it's really important. What is actually going through a test pilot's mind just before they put their airplane purposefully out of control in order to evaluate the edges of the envelope? Or if you're coming into combat and you've got a fully armed F-18 and you're about to intercept a fully armed bomber that's invading Canadian airspace, like I did a bunch of times, what's going on in your head? How do you feel? How are you thinking about this? How do you set up your emotions and your thinking in order to be able to do this very high pressure, very high consequence activity? And what's it feel like to be weightless, truly? What does it feel like to float to a window? What, you know, if you haven't done it, then the best you can do is guess, or, phone somebody and ask them to tell you what they thought it was like, and then try and properly adapt what they said into your own writing. I'm just lucky enough to have done those things and done them multiple times, so that I can draw on my own experience, not just for the technical stuff, but for how it feels and what's it like to be a human being doing these things. And also, what type of human beings do these things? Not everybody is a combat fighter pilot in a high performance airplane. Not everybody's a test pilot. Not everybody's an astronaut. So how come? What subset of humanity is best suited to be doing these things? If I was writing about, I don't know, people overwintering at the South Pole, not everybody does that. It's a subset of humanity that probably have some shared characteristics. And it'd be hard to guess what those characteristics would be, where you don't just drop into the easy trap of memes and stereotypes, like often happens, and just make everybody two-dimensional. And so I really think about it a lot, and try and make sure that the way that my characters think and behave is completely reflective of reality. And maybe the flip side of that, James, is it gives me a real strength, because my characters are well enough developed in my head, primarily my three main characters, but specifically Kaz and Svetlana. They are very clearly defined beings in my head. And so I often now just set up the technical situation, and then I just let them react. What would they do given these circumstances? And so I'm often surprised. I'm going, well, of course, that's what Svetlana would do right now. Crap, that wasn't what I was expecting. And therefore, I got to change my plot to allow for the reality of what a person like that would do given those set of circumstances. But I think that's all for the benefit of the reader.
So you're a busy guy. You do a lot of different things. One of the other things that we've noted that you're up to is that you have fallen to the dark side and have gotten into podcasting like us. And so you have a podcast called On Energy. What's that all about? Why did you decide to do that?
Well, so I do a lot of different things, as you mentioned. I help run several companies, and I also help run a big international technology incubator called the Creative Destruction Lab. And it was founded basically because we're going to peak at about 10 billion human beings, and we lack a lot of the fundamental necessary technologies in order to sustainably give a decent quality of life to 10 billion people. We can continue to do it on fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are amazing, but they're unsustainable. The reason the quality of life has gotten so great over the last 200 years for the majority of the world is the Industrial Revolution, intellectual property, but fundamentally the power that comes from fossil fuels. I was born and raised in Sarnia, Ontario. The first place in North America that oil was discovered and started being using as a product was here, right by Sarnia, Ontario, in the little town. There's two towns, Oil City and Petrolia. And that was in the 1850s. And that revolution and revelation in energy has been hugely important in the increased population of the world, because the quality of life got better. 200 years ago, half of everybody died as a child. Every other person died as a child just 200 years ago, 2 long lifetimes ago. And 90% of the world lived in abject poverty 200 years ago. That's not very long. The oldest person in the world lived to be almost 120. So it's just a little over, just 2 lives ago. Anyway, at the core of it all is energy. How are we generating energy? When Homo erectus who was the first to harness fire, what an amazing discovery that was. When they harnessed fire, it allowed them to leave Africa and move to places that you needed to stay warm at night. And they ended up spreading all the way to what is now Asia. And so energy is everything as far as our ability to comfortably live in all the places that we live. And it defines not just comfort, but the quality and the length of life itself. And there's a lot of confusion about it, a lot of misperception. And and also a lot of sort of over Pollyanna kind of optimistic thinking about it. And but everyone needs the lights on and the power on and the computers on a regular basis every day to stay productive and to stay healthy. And so I just thought it was a really important topic to talk about and to try and not talk politics, but actually just to bring a good cross section of energy from different perspectives. How do we grow food? How does food get to your table? What's the energy trail look like? What does an internet search using Google or now using Chat GPT or something? What does that actually? How much energy does that take, and what does that mean? The fact that some of the big companies are now restarting or building nuclear reactors just so that they can run the data centers so that you can do a Chat GPT search is worth knowing about and thinking about, and then what's going on with electricity and electric cars and battery storage and all the rest of it. I just thought it was a really worthwhile topic to dig into and to try and lend my understanding of it to as many people to think about as possible.
And as you were digging into that topic, were there any surprises? Was there something that surfaced that really kind of took you off guard that you thought was super cool?
Well, if you asked one of the AI, ChatGPT or Grok or whatever it is, if you ask it to generate an image for you, it takes about as much energy as driving a regular gas car about 4 miles. And yet you don't pay for it, right? Somebody's paying for that. But when how does the money trail close on that, right? And when you go to the gas pumps, you don't just fill your car up with gas and then someone later on says, oh, by the way, that was $80. You actually watch the little meter going and per second how much money of your own you're spending. But for some reason, we've got to the point now where you can spend your entire day burning energy way beyond the battery of your computer and just being completely unaware of it. And I'm sure that's not going to stay that way. Eventually we're going to have to find a way to bill people for the energy that they are burning up in order to use supercomputer remote power. And I just found that intriguing. The other thing, I was talking to some guys at John Deere about what they think about, and I grew up on a farm, so I'm hyper aware of farm life and what most people live in cities and they think farmers are stupid and uncaring, and that farmers don't really understand their land, and farmers don't like people in cities. They don't trust them, and they know for sure that city people don't understand farming at all. And I've never met anybody who cares more about the land, who is more stingy with their money and would never buy a buck's worth of fertilizer that they didn't absolutely need, and who doesn't need advice from some technician in a university to tell them how to make their land productive. And it was really interesting seeing the level of technology that is being integrated into the equipment and into the farmers' awareness. One of my good friends here near Sarnia runs a big farming operation, and he uses high tech every single day in order to be a better farmer and to use energy more productively. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting to go through it from an energy perspective or an energy lens to think about all of those societal problems.
It is really one of those things that we take for granted. It's part and parcel with everything that we do, energy, in our bodies, in our compute, in our vehicles. And so I actually did listen to some of the episodes, and it is, as you say, you don't get into the politics, but you get into the factual nature of these various elements of energy. And it is quite interesting to me. However, on the political side of it, there is some interesting politics around energy. But bringing it back to kind of geopolitics in space, your books talk a lot about geopolitics in space in the 70s. How do you think that differs or compares to the geopolitics in space today? Can you talk a bit about that?
History sure resembles itself because people are just people. If you look at my most recent book, Final Orbit, if you just describe it a certain way, it just sounds like today, where private companies are building rockets and they're building spaceships. And the space station that's up there is getting old. It's at the end of its life. And there's all sorts of conflict between the superpowers on Earth right now. And we're trying to find a way to deal with that. And space technology is really important in the conflicts that are going on. And China is emerging as a major power in Final Orbit, and of course all of that what I just said. That's what the headlines are all about right now. But that was also going on in 1975, just different characters and slightly different scripts, but the same sort of issues. And so when you're writing a fiction book, if you write it properly, I think people will not only be engrossed by the plot and dying to turn the page and find out what happens next to Svetlana and Kaz, but they'll also recognize the themes of what's happening. And maybe then when you read the headline of United States is launching a probe to the moon next February, or China has landed on the far side of the moon and returned a sample of the moon back. You can think back to the Lunokhod rover, or you can think back to the troubles that these folks faced, or the problems that are on the space station right now, and then look at some of the problems that develop in my fiction books. I think the underlying themes are quite common throughout history. But writing an interesting plot at this specific moment that engrosses people to the level that then maybe they can recognize the recurring themes. That's a fun sub-agenda for me. I'm looking forward to writing the next book in the series. This one just comes out soon, and then October 7th, I think, is a worldwide release. And all the books have been optioned for movie and TV, so we'll see if any of that ever works out. But that's never been my make or break, but it'd be fun if it did. The next book I'm doing is a young adult book, sort of similar to the idea of an astronaut's guide to life on Earth, but for people who are from 10 to 15, because that's a really angst-filled time when people are looking for a little guidance, even if they don't think about it. And so trying to write a useful book for 10 to 15-year-olds on important ideas of life. And then I'll write the fourth book in the Apollo Murder series, I think. And I've been toying with the idea of a pure science fiction book, maybe way in the future or way in the past or something. I'm also toying with the idea of a prequel in the Apollo Murder series. I think there's a lot of room as my characters become more defined. I could maybe write a prequel for Kaz and Svetlana. I don't know, but it's so delightful at this stage to be engaged the way I am in imagination and creativity and original thought. I'm doing lots of business and lots of work and lots of paying the bills kind of stuff, but also to try and be a useful musician and a useful writer and create some sort of art that other people can share my thoughts with. To me, it's just immensely satisfying.
I feel like that's kind of a good segue, actually. I have a question related to one of your nonfiction books that my wife gifted this to me after it came out. And, I was looking at it again as we were prepping for our interview and looking back at the fact section, I guess, of a reprint, I think. And there's the last one, and it asks, what's next for you in your life on Earth as a retired astronaut? And this is for people who may not have read An Astronaut's Guide to Life, but you should. And you give a nice personal answer, but you end with, mostly, I want to be useful, to feel that not only have I contributed to what is important to me, but that I will continue to be able to do so. And so I'm curious, Chris, it's been a while since that book was published. We've seen a lot of change in the world since then. We've seen from, extreme political polarization to the threat of climate change ramping up to the impending rise of AI. So what would you say to young people, or not so young people, about how they might go about finding purpose and usefulness in a connected, more so than ever, but also divided world?
I'm an engineer and a test pilot and an astronaut, and so I don't know if that's a chicken or an egg. I don't know if it's just my wiring or if it's also nurture that has changed me as I've gotten older. But fundamentally, you get to choose most of the things that you do. You got some compulsory stuff you got to do every day, and everybody does. You've got to take care of business. You got to depending what stage of life you're at, that business will be different things, school or work or taking care of a loved one or whatever. You got compulsories every day. And I sort of think of it like a figure skater, Elvis Stoico or somebody, where they've got the compulsories, right? You got to do the compulsories, and nobody even watches the compulsories because they're kind of boring. But that's what the judges are you got to have all those skills or you don't get to be a world-class figure skater. But every day I also notice that I have freestyle, and everybody does. You got all your compulsories, you got to take care of business, but you get some freestyle. And that's where the really great figure skating happens, right? That's where everything get put, and they take chances and they try crazy stuff, and that's where the real beautiful part of competition is. And so I ask people and myself more than anybody to think about, what is my compulsory every day? What are my freestyles? And how much of my life is just being eaten up by bad minute by minute decision making? How much of my 24 hours a day am I wasting just because I'm not recognizing that that's the freedom that I have, And so I try and be really deliberate with my time, really thoughtful of how I apportion my time, how I allocate my day. I set an alarm every day, and I exercise in the morning, and I think about what I'm going to eat, because if you actually want to have a long and productive life, you get to choose what you put in your mouth, and it's easy just to go, just this once, but and once in a while you don't want to, you're not a robot, but at the same time, taking responsibility for the small decisions in your life is hugely empowering, but only if they're in pursuit of some sort of goal. And I think everybody should have really powerful and compelling dreams of, if my life goes perfectly. It hasn't gone perfectly so far, that's for sure. But if my life went perfectly from this moment on, what might happen? What could happen? And that's when then, like, and it doesn't have to matter to anybody else. Maybe there's some fascination or some place or something or someone or something that is really important to you, and then recognize that within yourself, and then give that, and figuratively put it up on the wall in front of you. These are like the 25 things that I really value, or that are important, and that I hope happen in my life. And then, what am I doing today to change who I am, to move my life closer to those things? And I've got my compulsories all day long, but what am I going to do with my freestyle today in order to nudge my life a little bit closer? And if you want something to change, almost always you have to change yourself. Don't blame it on some politician or some billionaire or some CEO. That's just a cop-out. You actually have to change yourself if you want your world to change. And the only way that you're going to change yourself is by clearly understanding what you're trying to get done, and then on a minute by minute basis, taking responsibility for your small decisions. Those are the only ones you have. Your life is not what you planned to do. Your life is the strung together sequence of the little decisions that you made. So they're important, and recognizing how important they are. And also, you have a finite amount of them. So that's hugely empowering. It gives them value. And so I am very thoughtful. Like I said, hey, I want to write thriller fiction. I have no idea how to write thriller fiction, but it's on my wall. I want to do that. That would be really cool. I want to be a successful fiction author. I gotta start from zero. I gotta change who I am. I need to study. I need to learn. I need to reread the top 50 thriller fiction books that I've always loved, and figure out how did the author do that? And then I got to read Stephen King's book on writing, and I need to, how do you attribute a sentence? Like, if someone were writing our dialogue, they would say, and then James said, but how would you not always just say, and then James said, and then Chris said? How would you write? You got to learn how to do all those skills. And then you've got to edit it. And then you've got to accept the fact that some editor is going to come in and say, well, this is wrong and this is wrong. Because my first draft of the Apollo Murders was 195,000 words, because I didn't know what I didn't need to write. And the actual book ended up 135,000. We cut out a whole novel just because I'd written a bunch of stuff that didn't need to be written. I only say that to illustrate the process, that I gave myself a goal, and then I very methodically used the freestyle time I had and readjusted my time apportionment of my life to free myself up with time to write. And then I learned how to write by writing, and then worked with a professional author. The book you held up, Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, I worked with a professional writer for that one because I had to learn how. But now I'm skilled enough, I can just write on my own. But that whole process, and it's been going on for 15 years now, so that now I can do this thing. And it applies to everything. What do you value? What do you hope for? And what do you have to do every day? And then what are you actually doing with the freedom that you have every day? And every time you catch yourself watching a cat video or doing something that, unless you really want to watch that cat video, or you're just getting sidetracked from your own life, taking responsibility for the small decisions in your life is immensely empowering. And it's allowed me to lead the life that I've led so far.
Thank you, Chris, for joining us. Thank you, listeners. We appreciate you more than you know. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We sure enjoyed our time. Lots more to come on Tales from the Bridge. Until next time.